available and interested in doing so. So with that being said, I'm very excited for today's part one of two-part webinar. The second part will be next Tuesday. But for this first one, we'll jump right in. So I'm going to introduce our two speakers today. First, we have Walt Leger. So Walt is the Senior Vice President for Strategic Affairs and General Counsel at New Orleans & Company, the official destination marketing organization for the city of New Orleans. Boasting 1,100 member businesses, New Orleans & Company's goal is to cultivate and maintain a virtuous cycle between the business and attractions that make up the tourism industry, the visitors who invest in those businesses and attractions, and the city's residents who benefit from tourism. Walt is recognized or has been recognized across the state of Louisiana as a strategic thinker and fierce advocate. First as an assistant district attorney in New Orleans and later as an attorney with the law firm of Leger and Shaw, Walt has been a zealous advocate for his clients and victims of violent crime. Walt was elected in the fall of 2007 to the Louisiana House of Representatives for District 91, representing the neighborhoods across the city of New Orleans. He was reelected twice without opposition in 2011 and 2015. And in 2012, he was elected by acclamation to serve as a Speaker pro tempore of the Louisiana House of Representatives, the youngest member to ever serve in the second highest ranking position in the Louisiana House, a role in which he served again from 2016 to 2020. Walt left the legislature in 2020 due to term limits. Leger currently resides in New Orleans with his wife Danielle and daughters Kate and Caroline. Thank you, Walt.
Thank you.
Then up next, we have Julie Stokes. So former state legislature Julie Stokes gained traction early in the business community as a CPA, a small business owner, and a leader within many organizations such as the Jefferson Chamber, the LCPA, the YLC, the Regional Transit Authority, the University of New Orleans, and various civic and economic development entities. Over her 7 years of service in the Louisiana legislature, Julie Stokes gained a strong reputation as nonpartisan, policy advocate, and a cancer survivor. Mrs. Stokes gained significant experience with the Louisiana budget, comparative state tax policy, oversight of legislative audit, Louisiana's economic development incentives, and Louisiana's Department of Health policies. After receiving numerous accolades for her work in the legislature and then leaving public life behind in 2020, Mrs. Stokes has opened Flame Consulting to continue supporting projects that she is passionate about with fundraising, strategic planning, and consulting. Quite accomplished for you both. I'm very excited. So with that being said, we could go ahead and begin the webinar. Just a bit of housekeeping, which I emailed out. If you have any questions at all, please put them in the chat, and kind of when appropriate, I'll go ahead and flag those questions, and you'll be able to ask them to Julie and Walt. If you have a camera, again, encourage you to turn it on and try and make this as interactive as possible. Yeah, so with that said, Walt and Julie, take it over.
Well, thank you, Andrew, and thank you to Stephanie and the entire YLC team. We're excited. I know that Julie and I are both excited to be with you today, and also to be back together talking about something that I think we're both really passionate about, that is public service and service in the Louisiana legislature. I'm going to kind of jump in. We do have sort of a PowerPoint, and then we're going to shift over to Julie. We're going to go back and forth, and of course, we would be thrilled if you would just stop us and or submit some questions as we go along. We'd rather than saving questions for the end, we'd like to kind of dive into them as we move through it. So first, thank you for your interest in quote, demystifying the legislature. We're going to do our best to give you a little bit of insight, and then hopefully in our part two of the webinar, we'll dive into even more specifics. But I do think it's important to start out by just laying out some of the foundation for what the Louisiana legislature is. I know we've all at some point in our lives studied civics and learned how a bill becomes a law, mostly by focusing at the federal level at the U.S. Congress and how that functions. The Louisiana state government mirrors the federal system in many ways, but obviously has its differences. I wanted to start off by reading to you the preamble of the Constitution of the state of Louisiana. I don't think it's something that gets shared very often or that people even consider very often, unlike the preamble of the US Constitution. So I'll just read it to you to give you a little bit of a flavor for this document, a document that's been rewritten several times since the inception of Louisiana as a state, the last time being 1974. But what it says is, we, the people of Louisiana, grateful to the Almighty God for the civil, political, economic, and religious liberties we enjoy, and desiring to protect individual rights to life, liberty, and property, afford opportunity for the fullest development of the individual, assure equality of rights, promote the health, safety, education, and welfare of the people, maintain a representative and orderly government, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, and secure the blessings of freedom and justice to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution. The Constitution goes on to set up the 3 branches of government, much like our federal government, and it sets out in Article 3 the duties of the Louisiana legislature, and those are described in detail in Article 3 of the Constitution of the state of Louisiana. And what it essentially establishes is that the legislature is a continuous body that serves throughout the term of office, which is a 4-year term that runs commensurate with all statewide elected officials, including the governor, lieutenant governor, and so forth. All of those elections for the executive branch as well as the legislative branch occur at the same time every 4 years. The legislature generally is responsible for providing and setting general policy for the state through the enactment of laws, but also through the oversight of the administration of the state through a committee hearing structure that we'll address as we move forward. The legislators are elected from individual districts across the state of Louisiana. They are allowed to serve 3 consecutive 4-year terms of office before no longer being able to run due to term limits that have been established over the course of the last 15 years or so. And right now we're really experiencing term limits in its full force for the first time. In 2020, the first legislature that was elected as term limits came into effect was actually term limited. And so now we've seen a whole 12-year cycle of what those term limits look like. There are officers of each of the bodies that serve: the Speaker of the House and the Speaker Pro Tem of the House of Representatives, as well as the Senate President and the President Pro Tem of the Senate, that serve to administer the operations of the House and the Senate. I think Julie is going to sort of address the next slide and talk a little bit about what the sessions look like and how they get called.
Yeah, so the first thing that I'd like to say is it's nice to be back with YLC. I honestly credit the YLC with me being interested in any of this on any level. I started out as a CPA, and one of the first things they told us is that we had to get involved in the community. And a friend of mine got involved with the YLC, and so I got involved with the YLC. And that's where my love of serving the community and understanding the issues facing our state, the city that we all share, and the surrounding areas all became really drivers in my life. So without the YLC, I don't know that I would have ever, if I would have found that, but I'm really grateful that I did. So basically what you have here, if I would stay on the right slide, I'm trying to get our faces out of the way. We have general sessions every other year and fiscal sessions every other year. So basically in every even year, which was of course this year, 2020, will be general sessions. What that means is that there's 60 legislative days, but in reality, it looks like 3 months. So you look like you're in for 3 months. You get in April, you have April, May, you get in March. You have March, April, and May. You usually go a couple of days into June, but for the most part, those are your months. And during that time, there are no revenue bills allowed. So what that means is that if you have a fiscal crisis that you can only solve by generating additional revenue, which has happened numerous times in the last 4 years. You could not do that in those even numbered years. That's why you see what you see at the bottom of this column, extraordinary sessions. So very, very often in the last term, which Walt and I were part of, there were these extraordinary sessions to address fiscal issues. So jumping back a little bit to fiscal sessions, that's every other year, so that's your odd years. Those sessions are 45 legislative days, or what really works out to 2 months. So they usually start their April and May, still go, you know, it's a little bit after April starts, and it goes into June a little bit. Every legislator can open as many revenue generating bills or tax rate changes as they want. And that's kind of a travesty at times, because you'll end up with 30 variations of the same bill. And when you serve on Ways and Means, that can get pretty exhausting, I'll be honest. But the important part is too that every legislator can only have 5 bills that don't have to do with tax. What gets tricky here, and I actually tried to propose, or I got a constitutional amendment passed so that it would go on the ballot, but the ballot measure failed, because if your bill has to do with collection of tax or administration of tax, like for instance, if you had a bill that had to do with the motion picture tax credit, and you were dealing with some of the facets of how that tax operated, that would be considered a general bill. And so you really couldn't move, if you had many facets of tax legislation, you couldn't move your whole package because you were limited to these 5 general bills. And if you're somebody like me, you might have had also a cancer-related piece of legislation or just something else that was important to you. So oftentimes, that got to be a problem. So what I tried to pass was that anytime that a bill had to do with tax, it would be considered one of these tax bills. But that didn't work because the people, if it says the word tax in it, it scares the voters off, and it had the word tax in it. So another little interesting tidbit about the sessions and how they work is that if you think about it, the first year of every term is an even year. So you're always going to have a general session in your first year. And then if you think about that, your second and fourth years are going to be the fiscal sessions. So if you have important tax matters that have to be addressed in that last fiscal session of a term, you can imagine how it gets pretty difficult, because legislators don't want to take particularly bad votes in these fiscal sessions. And it actually, as far as I understand, and Walt might know the history a little bit better, but that it used to run the opposite way, and that the fiscal sessions were the first and third years of each term, and the generals were the second and fourth years. But then somebody kind of caught on to the fact that nobody wants to take a vote on a tax bill in the fourth year of a term, so they switched it around. And I don't know how many years ago that is, but it's an interesting tidbit about how we work things. Going back to extraordinary sessions, they're limited to 30 calendar days. They're convened by the governor or the majority, or they can be convened by the legislature. I believe that the one this time that we just came off of a regular session and an extraordinary session, that extraordinary session was convened by the legislature. And I think we're probably going to have another extraordinary session in the fall, but I'm not exactly sure who will call that one. It depends on what they want to put in the call. So whatever group calls the session determines what's in the call. And in these calls, you can spell out very specific things that can be addressed, and nothing outside of that call can be addressed in that session. So whether or not the session ends up being called by the governor or the legislature itself will probably be determined on what else the legislature might want to insert in it. You know, I think that if you are going into this next possible session and it ends up being completely about how we handle federal money and the crisis of COVID, you could see a session just called by the governor, run really simple. If the legislature though wants to address other items that don't fall into what the governor wants to do, you could actually, I think, see it called by the legislature. But anytime you have something to say about that, Walt, you can feel free to type in.
Yeah, I think I think everything that Julie's touched upon is really important to think about strategically how the legislature functions as it relates to the administration and the executive branch. And so she's already laid out a couple of things that I think are really critical. One to think about is the fact that the Constitution even provides for a general session in one year and a fiscal session in another is a limiting factor to the power of the legislature. A second thing that I think is that is an interesting concept is that the legislature in Louisiana is a part-time legislature. She's identified and pointed to the fact that we meet in general sessions for 85 days a year, fiscal sessions for 60 days a year in odd number years. And then, of course, if there are special sessions, we meet again. But otherwise, it is a part-time job, meaning that there are no retirement benefits and other things, but also meaning that the intention is that people who serve in the capacity and have other jobs or other livelihoods outside of that. Whereas the governor and the executive branch of our government in Louisiana is a full-time position that is operating 365 days a year. And so that certainly creates a different sort of balance than you see on the federal level. And so it's interesting to see those sort of limiting factors. Interestingly, back many years ago I guess now in 2010, the last time we had a redistricting session, which we'll be referencing again as we move forward, which happens every 10 years with the census. The legislature called itself into a special session to do that redistricting. But normally the governor is the individual who calls extraordinary sessions and who designates the call and what the topics of that session are. So the legislature taking the step back in June to call themselves into an extraordinary session was really not entirely unprecedented, but certainly breaks from the normal tradition of the governor setting the agenda and the call for those special sessions. And I think that speaks broadly to the interaction between the branches of government in today's political climate. And I think we should expect that once again in the fall, the legislature will call themselves into a special session so that they can set the agenda and what they want to take up in the call, as opposed to allowing the governor to set that agenda by calling it. But that's sort of the part of the nuance of the interaction between those entities.
Well, and a couple of things from what Walt just said. I hope I can remember number two after I say the first one. But when you think about the ramifications of it being a part-time legislature, the fact is you're not going to make a living off of this job. I mean, it literally pays what I don't even remember. It's one of those things I like to leave in the past, but like $18,000. And then you get another $6,000 when you add up these $500 payments that you get to cover expenses. And so the unfortunate part of that is that I think it only leaves certain people to be able to serve. Unless you already have money, you're independently wealthy, you have a spouse that, funds your life, or you have the most flexible job. I know, for us, I started a company with my husband. So I was able to be flexible. I was able to work as the CFO of that company and then kind of like have people trained to do that job for 2 or 3 months every year. But not everybody does that. Not everybody has that. And that is a very limiting factor on who can be part of it. I do remember the second part, thankfully. But that's this interplay of the legislature and the governor. It's really important, I think, and good that the legislature got more independent from the governor. That was something that certainly happened in our last term when the governor was a Democrat and the House and the Senate were Republican, especially the House. The House was heavily conservative. There's a difference though, and we'll talk about that probably a little bit in our next, talk, but there's independence and then there's downright adversarial, and what I like to see is an independent body that certainly, I like the fact that it calls itself in, but as long as we can stay working together and not adversarial, that's what you want.
I agree.
I knew you would. So organizational sessions. We'll go into that just a little bit. It only happens every 4 years, so it's on the day that you take office. So on the day that a new legislature legislature convened, like what happened in, I guess we comes in and takes their oath. And then, wait, no, I'm wrong, Walt. Because what the speaker is elected at the organizational session. Oh, and then it's all that, yeah. So
Correct.
you come together, you all get, installed in office. And then all throughout the preceding weeks and months, this race for who's going to be speaker has been going on behind the scenes. And on day one, everybody gets inaugurated, and then the race for speaker and speaker pro tem and Senate president pro tem take place. So that's just a couple of days. And let's see what else your little bullet points were. Yeah, I mean, then the races for committee chairmanships and how leadership is going to fall out happen after that organizational session. So day one, inaugurations, speaker and Senate president elections, and then you'll have, a speech by the governor also occurring on that day. Emergency sessions. The last time we had one of those, I guess, was when Kathleen Blanco had to hold an emergency session for Hurricane Katrina, right, Walt? You would have been there then.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you wouldn't have been there then.
No, I wasn't. But that's right. It was back then, and they largely function in the same fashion as an extraordinary session. As you see on the document, they can last 30 calendar days, but it's important to note they don't have to last that long. Extraordinary sessions can last as long as the legislature or the governor set them to be. They could be, you need a certain number of days in order to pass a piece of legislation, generally a week. But I would say they could last anywhere between a week and 30 days. So that's maybe, the emergency sessions tend to be shorter and to take up very specific issues relative to some emergent situation.
Yeah. And then veto sessions, which have not been called in my memory, would happen. They would happen 14 days after adjournment. So the two weeks after the session adjourns, which we call sine die, which is a weird word, but it's SINEDIE, kind of a weird word. First time I heard it was when I got into the legislature. But so for those 14 days, I would always go on vacation, because the only thing that happens is the governor's either signing or not signing bills. And so as I'm out of town, I watch the veto messages pour in. And luckily I have not been a victim of that ever. But yes. Walt would have been there. And then that 2 week ends and everybody gets a slip of paper. So everybody in the legislature gets a slip of paper and they say that they want to call a veto session. Actually, I think the vote is that you don't want to call a veto session. So if you want to call a veto session, you don't even have to send your paper back. But if you don't want to call a veto session, you have to let them know that. Which is probably something that Walt would also say about the balance of power, which is kind of just an interesting facet of how we do it. But when's the last time that happened, Walt? Do you know?
Yeah, it's probably the late 80s or early 90s, the last time there was actually a veto override. And I'm not sure if that happened in a veto session or not. It may have happened while they were still in session. So it's certainly not a common occurrence.
Right. And in this last set of sessions, because they called a special session that lasted 3 weeks, I think it was, because they called that session, they were in there during the veto period, but they still didn't override any vetoes. They were able to work out their differences and come to, solutions on the bills that were up for the governor's signature. So I'm going to switch over to the next slides.
Yeah, so as we're talking about the veto session and vetoes generally, I think it's important to note as we look at this map, and we'll talk about some of the numbers too. So the House of Representatives made up of 105 individual districts that are each made up of about 40,000 residents in the state of Louisiana. From each of those districts, a member is chosen to serve in the House of Representatives. So of those 105 members, 53 of them are required to enact a piece of legislation. 70 of them, or 2/3 of them, are required to enact a constitutional amendment or a tax. or a fee. And so additionally, as we talk about the veto, if a piece of legislation is passed by both the House and the Senate, and the governor does decide to veto it, a veto override would require a 2/3 vote. And so that's why there are rarely vetoes that are overridden or veto sessions that are called. So here's a map of the House of Representatives. It's hard to see in the more populated areas how small those districts get, but you can see from some of the more rural areas of the state, they can be geographically very large and yet still have only 40,000 residents in that geography. You see the two little cutouts of the map. The top one, I believe, is Orleans Parish, and the bottom one is East Baton Rouge Parish. Those are the two largest population centers. There may even be some of Jefferson Parish in there, or traditionally there will be, because they are similarly heavily populated. The next, go ahead.
I was just going to say almost all of it is. And I was wondering, Walt, my district would have been the hot pink one up in the top left. Walt, yeah. Where would you have been?
Yeah, so mine is, there's a pink district right near the crescent of the river, which is that kind of curved line in the middle. Mine is that red snake-shaped district, because there's a history of that from the redistricting fight of 2010 that we can get into in that next webinar, I think, as we talk about redistricting. But I probably have District 91 was one of the odder shaped districts because of a desire to get rid of it at one point. And fortunately, that didn't happen. I think fortunately for the state, but obviously fortunately for District 91 as well. The next slide deals with the Senate. In the Louisiana Senate, there are 39 members who represent individual districts. Those districts each represent about 108,000 residents. Similarly, you'll find that the districts are smaller geographically in the urban areas, and then larger geographically as you get to the more rural communities, as you have to kind of search to make sure you can draw in the 108,000 residents that are necessary to make up the Senate body. And so in order to pass a piece of legislation in the Senate, you need 20 votes. In order to pass a constitutional amendment, a tax, or a fee, you need 26 votes. And therefore, to override a veto of a piece of legislation, you would also need that 26 or 2/3 vote margin. And so that gives you an idea of what the legislature looks like. Those lines are drawn every 10 years after receiving data from the census that informs the legislature of of the population of the state of Louisiana. And we will once again be going through that process in the next year or so as the census wraps up in 2020, and then we'll cause the legislature to then be tasked with the job of redrawing district lines to ensure fair representation from a population standpoint across the state of Louisiana. And so one of the things that happened back in 2010, and that you can look for again to happen in 2020, is that population does shift. In 2010, we were still rebounding from Hurricane Katrina's population decrease. And so the city of New Orleans ultimately lost 2.5 House districts and a Senate district because our population had diminished. The numbers now put the population of New Orleans back at around 90% of its pre-Katrina population. So the expectation will be that there'll be a couple of additional legislative districts that, at least in the House and possibly in the Senate, that will come back to our area as you sort of even out that population. And so it will be interesting to see how those numbers actually fall as the census is completed. And that will have, ramifications for the makeup of the legislature and what it looks like. I see a question that just popped up about the census in Louisiana, small census self-reporting numbers. Yeah, we have traditionally not reported at a high level. I think 60% or 65% of respondents has been a good response rate for our state. That impacts us a lot more as it relates to our representation in the United States Congress, because in the same way that we in Louisiana have to seek to draw lines for the legislature that provide roughly the same population per district, the same is true for U.S. congressional representation. 535 members in our U.S. Congress are impacted, but state legislatures draw the congressional lines as well. And so getting an accurate count of our population is important. Over the last 20 years or so, we've fluctuated in our number of congressional members in Washington due to population shifts. In the last census, we lost a congressional member, and obviously we'd like to get one back at some point, and that can only happen by people participating and responding.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, one of the items on my agenda for the day is to draft an op-ed piece for the newspaper related to the census, because I started a women's group, Elevate Louisiana, and that's one of the things that we wanted to step out there and say to the people of Louisiana that we really need to do a better job. I think they've given us an extra few days, like we have until September 30th to improve our numbers. I'll be, putting that out there and tweeting that, and anybody we can get to retweet it, put it wherever they can to get people to be aware and fill out those census documents. And it only takes a second, but it could cost, I think every 1% cost our state $120 million of federal funding. So it could make a very big difference to our state to do a better job. All right, Walt. Did it switch? Yeah.
Yeah. So we reference that there are legislative leaders that are selected by the House at the organizational session. These are the current legislative leaders. Speaker of the House is Clay Schexnayder, and Speaker Pro Tem is Tanner McGee. And then in the Senate, the President of the Senate, Paige Cortez, and the Senate Pro Tem, President Pro Tem is Beth Mizell. These members are the only quote unquote officers of the legislature that are chosen by their peer members to provide representation. The two most important of those being the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate. They have the power not just to call each chamber into session on a daily basis when they're in session, but they actually appoint the chairman of every committee as well as the members of every committee of the Louisiana legislature. And so the power to be able to have control about what happens inside of those committees ultimately starts with the power of the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate to comprise those committees and to comprise the leadership of those committees. So they are truly important and powerful positions that ultimately have a lot of power to determine what the direction of the state of Louisiana and the legislature will be. The President Pro Tem and Speaker Pro Tem assist the Speaker in those roles and has constitutional authority to serve as an ex officio member of all committees of the legislature, and also to run the chamber in the absence of the Speaker and or the President. But the most significant power resides with the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate.
Yeah, and we talked about getting a little bit into the speaker's races and what a big impact it has. But I think looking at the time and what we have left, we're going to cover that next time because I think it fits in pretty well next time. I'm going to go ahead and go on to some of the leadership that has been chosen. That was the next one. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was just going to read. I was going to read through. I mean, we put a couple of pictures and also some individuals just to give you an idea of who these folks are that are chairmen of specific committees. But in the House of Representatives, there are 16 subject matter committees that ultimately hear pieces of legislation and receive testimony related to that legislation and must first approve those pieces of legislation before the full House or the full Senate considers them to be enacted into law. Each of these committees also has authority to oversee certain agencies and departments in state government, and that oversight role can take on a broad application, but certainly relates to the administration of policy that is set by law. I'll read off to you just some of those committees: Administration of Criminal Justice, Agriculture, Appropriations, which is the Budget Committee in the House, Civil Law and Procedure, Commerce, Education, Health and Welfare, House and Governmental Affairs, Insurance, Judiciary, Labor and Industrial, Municipal, Parochial Affairs, Natural Resources and Environment, Retirement, Transportation, and then Ways and Means, which is the Tax Committee in the House. You'll see that most of those committees have a partner in the Senate that matches up directly. There are a few differences. You'll see they have 3 judiciary committees in the Senate. Those roughly, connect to either criminal law, civil law, or the Judicial Committee in the House. You'll also note that in the Senate, they have a Natural Resources Committee and then a separate Environment Committee. But otherwise, these committees sort of match up. And in order for a bill to make it all the way through the process, it's got to be, it's got to receive a hearing in a committee, a subject matter committee. It's got to be reported favorably and then pass the House, go through a committee on the Senate side, and ultimately pass the Senate in the same format before it can even be considered for signature by the governor. So there's a lengthy process. I think we're going to talk a little bit about some of the general specifics of that, but these committees ultimately are the gatekeeper of bills, and it's important, very important work that they hear, often hundreds of bills a session, many of which don't make it out of committee, some of which that do, of course. And so their role is really central to the operation of the legislature.
Yeah, so here's a little bit more about, just how a bill becomes law. You might remember it from Schoolhouse Rock. It's not that much different, but basically it can start, a bill can start in the House or the Senate. So if it starts in the Senate, just know that what we're going over right now will be a bit flipped. But let's say that this one starts in the House, so it gets its first reading or it's introduced in the House. And for the bills that are early filed, so that means that they're filed within a timeline or a deadline set ahead of the session. These bills are read on the first day. So after you pick the speaker and, after you get, not pick the speaker, after you get into the regular session, the speaker's already picked and all the committees are in place. The first day of the regular session, you'll have a speech by the governor, and you might have some remarks back and forth between the House or the Senate, president and speaker, but then it launches into a really monotonous list of bills. And they basically say, and Walt, you should say it because you've said it a bunch of times. How do you say that what's the words that they say to introduce it?
What's that?
Like when you say the words to introduce a bill, because he's sat in the chair before and I have not.
Yeah, we literally have to read through each bill and then designate it to be assigned to a specific committee. And there's a lot of verbiage that goes along with that, but you have to read every bill. So that often takes hours the first couple of days of session just to get the bills referred to committee appropriately.
In their entirety, like every word of the bill?
No, just a descriptive title of the bill.
Yeah. So it'll say like,
it'll be like House Bill 103 relative to the state budget referred to the Committee on Appropriations. House Bill 104 relative to, putting roofs on the dugout of every baseball, at every baseball field in the state of Louisiana, referred to the Committee on Education. House Bill 105 relative to the Access to Open Waters Act, referred to the Committee on Environment, Natural Resources and Environment, and you basically just kind of keep going through, and it just takes time. But ultimately, what's important is it gives an opportunity for an idea. I wanted to mention this before, and I don't want to cut Julie off, but I think it's an important thing. Pieces of legislation are ultimately currency in the legislative session, and every legislator who is elected has the authority to file bills subject to the limitations that exist for fiscal sessions and non-fiscal sessions. In order to discuss, debate, and elevate an issue that may be very, very important to your constituents, filing a bill is the way to do that. And receiving a hearing in a committee is the way that you accomplish that, whether there's support for it or not. And so one of the things that I think is very special about our legislature, and something that we need to guard, very, very carefully, is that we have a tradition in the legislature that every bill that gets filed receives a committee hearing. And so that is not the case in the United States Congress, and it's not the case in most legislatures across the country, where they actually have committees controlled by leadership that either allow you to have a hearing or not. And so I could file a piece of legislation that I was the only person in the legislature that agreed with that policy. But as a practice in Louisiana, I would get to have a committee hearing, and I would get to put on testimony, and I would get to make my argument. And then the committee may very well vote it down. But I think it's really important that the conversations be had, and that you have the opportunity to persuade and educate on certain issues, because without it, you lose a portion of your democracy and of what makes our country special. So it can be a cumbersome process, and it can be overwhelming at times, but ultimately I think ours actually works well in that it guarantees a committee hearing to each member on each piece of legislation.
Yeah. So, and we'll talk a little bit more next time about choosing, the ability that the speaker and the president have of selecting the people on committees. It cannot be overstated. And we'll talk about that a little bit more next time. But basically, you have a bill that gets a first reading in the House, very mundane. The whole first week is reading bills in. They'll get referred to a committee. Then they go to that committee hearing. So after it gets referred to committee on second reading, it gets referred over, and that's how you're basically letting the public know that it's coming, right? And then a couple of days before the committee meeting happens, they'll publish an agenda that will tell you what's going to be on the agenda for that committee. So if you're following a specific piece of legislation, all of a sudden, and I'll show you how to do this, you'll get a notice saying that it's about to be heard in committee. Inside the committee is really your only chance for public testimony. It's in this committee that it's where you would go, or anybody who's passionate about an issue or that has a stake in the issue, et cetera, to go sit down at the table and explain their position on the bill. You have that opportunity at the House committee hearing, and then again when that same bill gets to the Senate, and we'll talk about that in a second. From that committee meeting, the committee will either report the bill favorably, at which point it would then go to the full House for a vote, or it would report it with amendments, which then it would go to the House floors too, or they could involuntarily defer it, which is the ugliest form of deferring, which means that you don't really get an opportunity, that bill's dead. Or they could also voluntarily defer the bill, which means that if the author tweaks certain issues, they might be able to hear it again the next week when that same committee meets. After that, you have a third reading, which is basically where the bill is brought out of committee and it's read onto the floor. And then a couple of days after that, it will be spoken about on the floor. Now, there's no public that can get involved on the House floor. That's when your lobbying efforts have to switch from these however many 8 to 20 committee members to now you have to address maybe 105 people to try to get them in like back conversations. You have to talk to them individually because you don't have a chance. Nobody can go to the front of the House or the front of the Senate to discuss a bill from the public. So that's very limited. So you've got to have your legislator ready. Your legislator's got to be able to say everything that needs to be said about that bill to get it passed. And you've got to have 105 in the House or 39 people in the Senate that will support the bill. So we'll talk about that a little bit more next time too. So when it votes final passage from the House, then it passes over to the Senate. If it fails, it can be reconsidered, or it may not be reconsidered. So if a bill fails, oftentimes it can be reconsidered. If it receives more, if it doesn't receive the sufficient number of votes to be positive, there are conditions in which it can be reconsidered. There are also times when it cannot be. Then you move over to it being introduced, same thing, introduced in the Senate, referred to a committee meeting in the Senate, the same exact, it's all the same number of days, basically. Once it is referred to that committee, it's put onto a committee agenda and then goes through another committee hearing where the public can then again appear and speak in favor of a proposed, or even come to the committee with proposed amendments. Then the committee reports it in the exact same way that they did in the House, which is they can report it favorably, you know, involuntarily deferred, et cetera. Then it takes a stop at what's called the Legislative Bureau for wording corrections, little typos and stuff like that. And then it goes to debating on the Senate floor in this instance, which would be the third reading. And then the Senate gets to vote yes or no on the bill. If it's amended, it needs to go back to the House to be concurred. So the amendments get concurred in. If it passes without any amendments in the Senate, then it can go straight to the governor's desk to be signed. If there are amendments and it's not just a simple, yeah, the House is perfectly fine with those amendments and we do what's called concurring those amendments in, then it can go to a conference committee, which would be made up of 3 House members and 3 Senate members, and they would resolve the issues. There would be a conference committee report that would be given to all of the members of the body, the House or the Senate, and then they would both take action to adopt that conference committee report. Then it would go to the governor's desk. And then, of course, like we talked about, the governor can veto it. If it gets vetoed, you could have a veto session, which never happens. If he does sign it, then that's when sometimes you get to go be part of a bill signing if it's an important enough piece of legislation, and then it becomes an official act.
So Julie, I just want to, and Walt, we have 10 minutes left. We did have a few other questions in the chat. Julie, thank you for, or I'm sorry, Walt, thank you for answering some of them. Amy, I saw you had a question related to I guess, kind of YLC and involvement.
Yeah, I was just asking Julie, you mentioned that YLC got you interested in politics, and I just wanted to know what the steps you took were to get involved, and what can other YLC members do to get involved if they're interested as well.
Yeah, so for me, what happened is I was involved with Recreate New Orleans, and I became, I forget what it was called, but an area, like I was in charge of a few different committees at one point, and I was on the board. And I really became interested in government just during all of that. And I wanted to have a Jefferson Parish committee, kind of the way we had an Orleans committee, like a government committee. Does YLC still have that?
No.
No. So it was a government committee that got involved with Orleans. And I wanted to do one in Jefferson, but there was a group already forming in Jefferson that was going to kind of do that. So then I moved over and got involved in that. When I got involved in that, I became president of that. Like I was the second president of it, which put me on the Jefferson Chamber Board of Directors, which then put me on the government committee because they wanted me to join another committee. And then that put me on transition teams here and there when a new, somebody in Kenner would take office or a new parish president. I ended up on those transition teams and just part of other little breakout economic development groups. And I was president of my civic association and president of women accountants and president of the Jefferson Young Leaders, which was what their group was called at the time. And, you know, just things just built to that point. Oh, and then I got involved with, you know, more partisan government groups at the time. There was a group that we had formed, the Young Republican something. I don't even remember because it doesn't exist anymore. but I got involved in that, and I got to know a couple of friends in the legislature through that. And when the guy, Tony Legee, who was my predecessor, when he resigned, one of those friends called and said, "This is it, you should run for it," because that was my legislator. And, you know, boom. And once you do it, it just changes your life. I mean, honestly, I became it. You can have it not change your life. I can tell you that for sure. I know Walt was a very prolific legislator, and I was a pretty prolific legislator too. I think I was always in the top 8 or so of the number of bills I'd get passed every year. And Walt and JP Morrell were probably the first. I mean, you and JP probably had the most bills passed of any legislators. But when you study like that and you really give yourself to it, it changes your life. You can also get in the legislature and never pass a bill and never author a bill. You can do that. That's one way to go, but that's not the way that either one of us kind of chose.
Yeah, Julie, you make a great point on that. I mean, we talked about the 16 different committees. I think that if you're a legislator who's interested in all of the different aspects of what's happening with our state government, then you tend to file bills that appear in many different committees. There are certainly people who, based on their background, are attracted to certain committees. I mean, if you're a farmer in rural Louisiana, then you may be the most knowledgeable place for you to serve may be on the Agriculture Committee. In my case, that probably wouldn't have been the best fit for an urban district in, Central City and uptown New Orleans. When I first got to the legislature, my background was I had been a lawyer in private practice, but I also had been a prosecutor in the district attorney's office, which had largely been the motivation for me wanting to get involved in politics. I had seen firsthand, one, that while it was important to have people willing to represent the needs of our community and try to promote public safety and take violent offenders off the street, there was also a huge problem with the way that we prosecuted drug crimes and less serious crimes and the types of sentences that people were getting, particularly those, in my opinion, related to drug crimes, where education and treatment could have been much better options as opposed to just incarcerating everyone who had a drug problem. I mean, that's clearly not working for us. And so rather than continue on that track, I wanted to be involved in trying to find solutions for that. And I think we have found some. We have a lot more work to do, but it ultimately led to the creation of the Justice Reinvestment Task Force and the passage of 10 bills that are that are the criminal justice reform package of Louisiana that was passed in 2017. That's become very meaningful. But that took me about 8 years of fighting and educating to get there, and service on the Criminal Justice Committee, service on the Education Committee, and probably the most important service was my service on the Appropriations Committee for 12 years, because in the Budget Committee, you generally get this like broad view of government as a whole. And so, as Julie was suggesting, I mean, I had bills that were related to coastal restoration and hurricane protection, criminal justice, the budget and tax. Julie and I had, packages of bills that we worked on together for years, trying to get meaningful budget and tax reform that ultimately will have to get done in our state if we want to move forward. But we could never quite get where we needed to go because of the politics of the time. But anyway, all that to say, there certainly are legislators who don't file bills and who don't, and that's not their focus. Their focus is representing their constituents and voting the minds of their constituents. I think there are other viewpoints, and certainly I think Julie and I both shared the idea that we needed to be more than just someone who pressed a button, yes or no, on other people's legislation, and that it was important to push for meaningful reforms and changes to things that weren't working or aren't working for the state. And so there are definitely different approaches.
And I think that in that, what I hear is leadership isn't just about taking the easy route sometimes. Leadership is about sometimes presenting the harder choice that might be a better choice for the future of a state. And that I think, honestly, that caused me trouble at times, but I wouldn't do it different for anything on earth. You know, I think that there are times when you need to bring the hard news. I mean, and we had some hard news in the last term that Walt and I shared. I mean, honestly, we had a state that had actual fiscal problems and actual revenue problems, and they were bad. And, you know, I didn't always go with the flow. I wanted, as a CPA, because that's my background, right? Just like Walt came at it from a legal perspective, I came at it from a CPA perspective. And for me, a narrative about the numbers wasn't viable. I couldn't do a narrative about the numbers. I had to be factual, and I did presentations all over the state. I really dug in and studied tax structures between states, and even looked at like GDP of states that had certain tax policies versus, you know, had other tax policies, to try to really figure out what would be the best structure for our state. And we even had models of plans that would have worked, and were largely based, I mean, what Walt and I were trying to do, which was North Carolina just a few years before. And they kind of killed it economically, and we wouldn't make any of those moves. And it wasn't because of people that were, you know, willing to make the hard choices. It was because of a very partisan political climate that it just couldn't be done.
Julie,
yeah,
yeah, I was going to stop you there. I think that little example is an excellent segue into next Tuesday's session, where titled Lessons in Legislative Leadership. So yeah, I do want to pause. Any last questions from those in attendance before we wrap up today? I think we got through everyone in the chat, but if it's not been asked, please do so.
Yeah, and if there are any questions between now and next week, you know, submit them to YLC, and we'll be prepared to kind of get those responded to for the next time we get together. But it's been fun to cover some of these nuts and bolts, and I think next week we'll be able to dig into some of the, you know, actual how you put together coalitions and get things done.
Yeah, it was a great teaser.
I want to open next week just really quick with how to use the website, because we have an amazing website that's really strong, and we only take 5 minutes to show you guys around that too.
Perfect. Yeah, and we can certainly get out some of these slides too. I saw that was asked in the chat as well, so we can share these slides with everyone. Okie doke. Walt and Julie, on behalf of everyone, thank you so much for that hour. I know I'm very excited for the one next Tuesday. And yeah, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to maybe send those in advance as well to the membership VP at ylcnola.org. You can find it on the website.
Thank you. Enjoyed it. Everybody have a great day.
Great to see everybody. Thank you.